Have you ever found yourself in a situation where it seemed like everything was lost? Have you ever felt that nervous feeling when facing a difficult decision, knowing that your choice could change everything? Now, imagine being in a moment where the fate of your entire people depends on a single action, and that action must be perfect. It sounds like a movie plot, doesn't it? But it is a real story that happened over 2,000 years ago, involving a woman who, through courage, wisdom, and faith, changed the destiny of a nation. Today, we're going to talk about Esther, a young woman who found herself in a situation that seemed impossible to save. However, through her actions, she taught 3 powerful lessons that can transform your life. Have you ever thought about what decisions you would make if your life were about to be destroyed and you were the only one capable of changing that? And what if I told you that Esther's choices could teach exactly what you need to save what seems inevitable in your own life? Stay with us, because Esther's story will surprise you, and her lessons will make you look at challenges in a completely different way. Welcome to the Curious Bible channel. Be sure to subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any biblical curiosities. Esther never imagined that her life would take such extraordinary turns. A simple young woman with no great wealth or status, her life seemed peaceful until the moment she was chosen to become the queen of the Persian Empire. Esther was a humble Jewish woman raised by her cousin Mordecai after the death of her parents, but fate led her to the royal palace, and with her beauty, she won the heart of King Xerxes. For many, this would be the start of a fairy tale, a simple woman who becomes the queen of one of the greatest powers of the ancient world. But like any epic story, there was a twist. It didn't take long for Esther to discover that the kingdom she lived in was on the brink of chaos. The wicked Haman, a high-ranking official in the empire, had devised a wicked plan to exterminate the Jews. Driven by uncontrollable hatred, he managed to convince King Xerxes to sign a decree condemning the Jews to death. The fact that Esther was Jewish was about to put her life and her people's lives in grave danger. However, the most intriguing part was that, until then, Esther had no knowledge of the conspiracy. King Xerxes, unaware of Haman's evil plan, had no idea that his wife was in danger. Esther found herself in a unique position. She was the queen, yet also a part of a people who were about to be destroyed. This put her at a crossroads that would require courage, wisdom, and faith. The situation seemed almost irreversible. Haman, with his cunning, had already manipulated the king's mind, and the death decree was ready to be carried out. Esther knew that the only way to save her people was to act quickly. However, in doing so, she would have to make a decision that could change the course of her life forever. If she went to the king without being summoned, she could be condemned to death, a severe violation of Persian law. But what would she do? Would she accept her people's fate without fighting, or would she risk her life for something greater? Courage is a fascinating thing because it doesn't come suddenly. It is forged in the most difficult situations. Upon learning of Haman's plan, Esther had a moment of deep reflection. There was no other option. She knew she had to risk her life to save her people. Fear was present, no doubt, but something greater compelled Esther to move forward. It was at this moment that she made the choice that would alter her story and the story of many others. She decided that to save her people, she needed to put her life at risk and present herself to the king without being summoned. The first lesson we can learn from Esther here is about the courage to act even when everything seems lost. Esther wasn't sure what would happen. She knew her actions could mean her death, but she didn't hesitate. She did what was necessary, even with a heart heavy with fear. She sent a request to all the Jews in the empire to fast and pray for her, for she knew she would need divine strength to face the difficult task ahead. Fasting and prayer demonstrate another great lesson from Esther. When facing impossible challenges, we must seek strength beyond ourselves. Esther knew she couldn't do everything on her own. She trusted God to guide her and give her the strength to make the right decision, even when the situation seemed hopeless. By asking her people to unite in prayer and fasting, Esther was seeking divine intervention and creating a spiritual support network to help her endure the difficult moments that lay ahead. The next day, Esther prepared for the great task. She put on her royal robes, filled herself with courage, and went to the throne room where King Xerxes was. Her heart raced and fear nearly paralyzed her, but she took the decisive step. She entered the room, and to her surprise, the king did not reject her. He extended the scepter, signaling that she would not be punished. The feeling of relief was brief, but significant. Esther had taken the first step. Now, she needed to find the best way to approach the king and reveal the truth. The king, surprised by her visit, asked Esther what she wanted, offering her even half the kingdom. Such was his regard for her. Esther, however, did not rush to reveal everything. Instead, she used her wisdom to invite the king and Haman to a banquet, where she would have the opportunity to present her petition carefully and strategically. What seemed like a moment of vulnerability for Esther became an opportunity for her to act with great wisdom, preparing the ground for the revelation that would change everything. In this first chapter, we see that Esther, faced with an impossible situation, was able to act with courage and seek strength from God to make difficult decisions. She taught that even when everything seems lost, a courageous and strategic attitude can change everything. But what did Esther do at the banquet? How did she use her wisdom to turn the tide against Haman? The path to saving her people was still full of dangers, and the next lesson she teaches us will be crucial for the next steps of this story. Esther, a simple young woman, found herself at the center of an unexpected destiny, to be queen of a powerful empire. But when she discovered a plan that could destroy her people, she had to make a choice that would change everything. What would she do? Would she risk her life to save hers? Stay with me and discover how Esther's courage and faith challenged even the strongest empire in the world. The banquet that Esther prepared was a masterpiece of strategy and patience. With the king's permission, she invited Haman, the main figure responsible for the threat to her life and that of her people, to join her for a special meal. At first, it seemed like a friendly gesture, an opportunity to strengthen bonds and gain trust. But in reality, Esther was plotting a bold plan. She knew that the revelation she was about to make would change everything, and she needed the right moment to deeply impact the king. Haman, unsuspecting of anything, felt flattered by the invitation. He was an arrogant man and believed his position in the empire was unshakable. He saw himself as untouchable, immune to any threat. During the banquet, he reveled in the attention he was receiving, his actions full of confidence. However, this comfort and security were only a facade, as what he did not know was that he was about to become the center of a great strategic move by Esther. During the meal, King Xerxes, charmed by Esther's demeanor and the splendor of the banquet, asked again what she desired. He was so impressed by the courage and intelligence of the queen that he offered up to half of his kingdom in exchange for a request. But Esther did not answer immediately. She knew that the time for her revelation had not yet come. She used her diplomatic skills to ask that the king and Haman attend another banquet the next day, creating even greater anticipation. She was not just preparing a revelation, she was building the tension necessary to make the impact of her words even more devastating. This second meal would be the key to everyone's fate. The suspense had been created, and the king was as curious as Haman, who began to feel increasingly honored by their presence beside him. However, Esther's moment was approaching, and she needed one more push toward action. What Esther was mastering here was building the right timing for the big confrontation, with patience without haste, but with wisdom. Meanwhile, Esther's anxiety grew with each passing moment. She knew that time was running out, and her people were depending on her to make the right decision. She also knew that she needed to be cautious in exposing Haman, for he was not just a royal advisor, he had influence and power. Esther was fully aware that her words needed to be as precise and impactful as possible to avoid creating more problems than solutions. The lesson here is clear. Wisdom and patience are essential in moments of great pressure. Esther could have rushed in and revealed everything at once, but she knew that the key to victory lay in perfect timing. Instead of acting impulsively, she built the tension, creating the ideal scenario for her words to resonate with the necessary weight. Esther's wisdom was not just in knowing what to say, but in how to say it. She had the power to turn the tables, but she waited for the right moment. At the second banquet, the king, eager to discover what Esther truly wanted, again offered up to half of his kingdom. It was at that moment that Esther, with the greatest serenity, revealed the truth in a surprising manner. She declared that she and her people were Jews, and that the death decree signed by King Xerxes under Haman's influence was about to destroy her life and the lives of all the Jews in the empire. The king was stunned, speechless, and Haman, faced with the gravity of the accusations, did not know how to react. The revelation was like a bomb, and the silence that followed was deafening. It was a brilliant move by Esther. She did not attack Haman directly, but she did so in such a strategic and impactful way that he was completely disarmed. He who had thought himself invincible now stood before an accusation that was impossible to deny. The king, furious, stood up from the table and withdrew to the garden, trying to process what he had just heard. While he was away, Haman, desperate, threw himself at Esther's feet, pleading for his life. But when the king returned, he found Haman in a compromising position, even more guilty given the situation. What followed was one of the greatest reversals in history. The king, consumed by rage and betrayal, ordered Haman's immediate execution. Haman, the man who had plotted the deaths of so many, now faced his own end. His downfall was swift, and Esther's victory, which had seemed impossible, was within reach. In this second chapter, the great lesson is about the importance of using strategic wisdom to achieve your goals. Esther, with patience and intelligence, created the perfect opportunity to reveal the truth and turn the tide against those who sought to destroy her people. She demonstrated that often victory does not come from brute force, but from the ability to control the situation and act with wisdom. But Esther's battle was not over. Despite Haman's downfall, the decree was still in effect. The fate of the Jewish people was far from guaranteed, and Esther knew that more challenges were ahead. How could she and the king reverse the fatal decree? Would you be able to stay calm and wait for the perfect moment to act, even with your life and the lives of everyone around you at risk? Esther did exactly that. She used patience and wisdom to turn the table against an unbeatable enemy. But has her greatest challenge passed? Stay with me to discover how one strategic decision changed everything and saved her people. King Xerxes had made his decision regarding Haman, but that didn't mean the problem was resolved. The death decree against the Jews was still in effect, and Haman's plan, now deceased, continued to be a real threat. Esther knew that the real battle was yet to come, and that the situation of her people, her own people, demanded another courageous action. The power she held was in her hands, but she needed to use it strategically once again. She had been the heroine in revealing the truth, but now it was time to act to ensure the Jews were saved. The king, although deeply disturbed by the revelation, couldn't simply revoke a decree that had been sealed with his own seal. This meant that, in order for her people's lives to be saved, Esther would have to take one more bold step. She would need to intercede personally on behalf of the Jews. And this would be a risky task. At the time, the king's court protocol was strict. No one could approach the king unless summoned, under the penalty of death. When Esther realized that the situation required her direct intervention, she knew it would entail tremendous risk. But she was willing to risk everything to save her nation. With a heart full of courage and faith, she asked all the Jews to pray and fast with her for 3 days before taking the final action. During this time, Esther remained resolute, fully aware that her request to the king could be an act of great risk. She knew that by entering the king's presence uninvited, she could be sentenced to death unless the king extended his scepter, signaling his acceptance. But she also knew that the need to save her people outweighed the fear. During those 3 days of prayer and fasting, she sought strength from God, crying out for wisdom and courage to face what lay ahead. On the 3rd day, Esther donned her finest attire and with firm and determined steps approached the throne room. When she entered, King Xerxes saw her and surprisingly extended the scepter in her direction, signaling that she could approach. At that moment, Esther knew this was the moment her courage would be tested most intensely. She didn't know what the king's reaction would be, but she was ready to face whatever came. She knew her role wasn't just to be a wife, but to be a savior for her people. As she approached, Esther bowed before the king and made her request, but instead of directly asking for the decree's forgiveness, she once again used her cleverness. Esther asked for a new banquet, again with Haman present, so she could make her personal request. This request, at first glance, might seem like a strategy to buy more time, but in reality, she was setting the stage for another strategic action. Esther was once again manipulating the situation in her favor, creating a space where she could act with more security. The king, intrigued, agreed to the request and arranged the banquet for the following day. In the meantime, Esther didn't miss the opportunity to observe and plan every detail of her next move. She knew she had to be extremely careful because her words now had the power to either save or condemn her people. This 3rd chapter highlights a fundamental lesson: the power of intercession and courage in the face of a great challenge. Esther couldn't wait for things to change on their own. She had to act, risking her own life to intercede on behalf of her people. Esther's courage teaches us that often the greatest step toward change is not waiting passively, but taking a bold action and interceding in times of crisis. Esther's great effort also shows us that when we place our trust in God and take action with faith, even in the most difficult situations, divine intervention can provide the wisdom and courage necessary to triumph over any adversity. Esther was a woman of faith, and her example still inspires us today to act with courage, especially when faced with challenges that seem impossible. The situation seemed to be heading toward a great revelation at the banquet the following day. But with Haman's presence and the accumulated tension, what Esther would do next could change everything. How would she manage to act to reverse the decree and save the Jewish people? Let's continue to see how the outcome of her courage and faith begins to unfold. The following day, the grand banquet that Esther had prepared began, and the tension in the air was palpable. King Ahasuerus was present, sitting at his royal table, and Haman, unaware of what was to come, sat beside him, enjoying the queen's hospitality. He, who had been so sure of his position of power, seemed oblivious to the fact that his own downfall was about to be orchestrated by a Jewish woman who, until recently, had seemed like nothing more than a piece in the royal game. But as always, Esther had a plan in mind. With the guests seated and the atmosphere marked by opulence and formality, Esther finally addressed the king. Her mind was clear, but her heart was tight, because she knew this was the moment of truth. She had asked for the banquet for a very specific reason. She needed an environment where the right words could be spoken without haste and where she could maintain control of the situation. And that is exactly what she would do. The king, curious, asked Queen Esther what she desired. He knew she had not come just for a meal. It was time for her to reveal the reason for her bold approach. He knew that normally women did not dare ask the king for anything directly, especially without a good reason. The queen, however, did not hesitate. With her wisdom and composure, Esther made her request. "If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, let my life be granted me and the life of my people also." The king was surprised and immediately asked who would dare commit such an act against the queen and her people. Esther then revealed the name of the person behind the whole plot of destruction: Haman. The revelation hit like a bombshell. The man whom the king had favored, who sat beside him and boasted of his position, was responsible for the death decree against the Jews. The room fell into absolute silence as King Ahasuerus processed Esther's words. The king's reaction was immediate, but there was still something Esther had to do: ensure that her people would be saved. The king, enraged and surprised, momentarily withdrew to the garden, seeking space to deal with the situation. Haman, on the other hand, was left completely speechless. He knew his situation was becoming desperate. He desperately tried to justify himself to Esther and the king, but the truth was now evident to everyone. Haman's fate was sealed at that moment. He, who had thought his scheme was indestructible, was now facing the justice he had created for himself. While the king was in the garden, Esther remained firm in her position. She knew the king had authority, but she also knew he needed a push to do what was right. Beside her, Haman tried to kneel and beg for forgiveness, but his attempt was in vain. The evil he had caused was beyond any excuse. Even if the king returned, Esther knew he would need to act quickly to reverse the situation. The king returned to the room furious and ordered that Haman be arrested immediately. The king's servants, obeying his command, apprehended Haman and led him out. Later, he would be hanged on the same gallows he had built for Mordecai, Esther's uncle, who had refused to bow to him. Justice, in a dramatic yet necessary manner, would be served. This chapter of Esther's story teaches us another powerful lesson. The revelation of truth is an act of courage that often requires patience and discernment. Esther knew that exposing Haman as the enemy was not just a matter of revealing him, but doing so at the right moment, with the right strategy. She showed that patience and timing are essential, especially when dealing with those who believe they are above any law or morality. Esther's courage was not just in revealing the enemy, but in knowing when and how to do it so that her action would be effective. It was not merely about revenge, but a strategic move to ensure the survival of her people. The fact that Esther kept her calm and wisdom under pressure teaches us the importance of acting with discernment, not just reacting. With Haman arrested and the truth revealed, the path seemed clear for the salvation of the Jewish people. But a new issue arose. The decree was still in effect, and nothing could be done without a new order. What would Esther do now? The fate of the Jewish people is at stake, and Esther is about to risk her own life to change everything. Can you imagine what she did, even knowing she could be condemned to death? Will what she asked the king be enough to save her people? Don't miss what happens in the next bold move by Esther. Let's see how she handles this new obstacle in the next part of the video. And don't forget to comment at the end of the video about these lessons. Your opinion matters. Now that the traitor Haman was out of the picture, one crucial issue remained: the royal decree, still in effect, condemning all Jews to death. Even with Haman's downfall, King Xerxes could not simply erase the order he had previously given. The king's decrees were irrevocable, an unbreakable tradition of the Persian Empire. This left Esther in a difficult position. She knew that her people were still at risk, and now it was her mission to save them. But how? Without hesitation, Esther took a decisive step. She knew the only way to save her people was to approach the king once more, but this time in a more daring and risky manner. She couldn't simply wait for the king to change his mind on his own. She would have to act, once again, with courage, wisdom, and faith. With the support of Mordecai, her uncle, Esther prepared for yet another approach. This time, she knew it would be a much harder conversation. She appeared before the king again, but this time she wasn't as certain he would receive her as easily. After all, she had already approached him to expose Haman, and now she needed to convince him that the fate of an entire people was in his hands. As she entered the king's presence, Esther bowed before him, acknowledging his authority, but also making it clear that she wasn't there just as a queen, but as a woman representing the hopes and lives of an entire people. The king, now calmer, looked at Esther with a curious gaze. He knew she wasn't there on a whim, and the concern in her eyes made it clear that she had something serious to say. Esther, with a firm voice, spoke again. "O king, the decree signed by Haman cannot remain in effect. If you keep it, all my people will be destroyed. I beg for your mercy." The king, perplexed, asked why he had not been informed earlier about the gravity of the matter, as he had never known Esther was Jewish. Esther explained that, as part of Haman's plan, the secret of her identity had been kept, but now it was impossible to hide the truth any longer. The king, moved by Esther's words and the sincerity in her voice, looked at her and said, "I cannot change the decree, but I can allow the Jews to defend themselves." Although the original order couldn't be revoked, the king decided that the Jews could unite and fight to protect themselves. He wrote a new letter, which was sent throughout the empire, ensuring that the Jews could defend themselves against the enemy forces. While the death decree was not annulled, this new order was a significant victory. Esther knew that now the Jewish people had a real chance of survival, a chance that had previously seemed impossible. The king's decision to allow the Jews to defend themselves was a major step forward, but there was still much to be done. Esther and Mordecai were aware that now the battle was on the ground, not just in the palace, but in the streets and villages of the empire. What remained was the strength and unity of the Jewish people. Esther's courage had inspired the king to act, but now the Jewish people would need to show their strength. Feeling the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders, Esther knew her mission didn't end there. She had won a battle, but the war for her people's survival had only just begun. With the king's new order, the Jews now had a chance, but they needed to act quickly to ensure salvation was possible. And that meant rallying all forces to prepare for the day of battle. Mordecai, for his part, rose with renewed courage. He also sent letters to all the provinces, organizing the Jews and calling them to action. He became a figure of leadership, working tirelessly to ensure the Jews were ready for the approaching confrontation. This chapter in the story of Esther teaches us another powerful lesson. No matter how difficult the situation may seem, there is always an opportunity for change. Even when it appears that all doors are closed, there is always a way forward. Esther didn't settle for the idea that the situation was beyond control. She did what was necessary, seeking justice strategically, even knowing the process would be difficult and full of obstacles. She used her position to make a difference and with wisdom found a way to fight for the survival of her people. Esther showed that when facing an apparently invincible enemy, you should not give up. Instead, you should look for creative solutions, use your resources as best as possible, and have the courage to act, even when the future seems uncertain. The struggle for her people's salvation was only beginning, but Esther had already taken the first step toward victory. Now that the Jews had a chance to defend themselves, a new question arose. How could they ensure victory in battle? Unity would be key for the salvation plan to succeed. Do you think Esther was able to save her people with a simple request to the king? Even after everything that happened, the struggle was far from over. The battle was just beginning, and the salvation of the Jewish people was at stake. Find out what she did when it seemed like there was no more hope, and how her courage changed the fate of all. Stay tuned, because what comes next might surprise you. Don't forget to comment at the end of the video about these lessons. Your opinion is important. With the new decree from King Xerxes in place, the fate of the Jewish people was finally in their own hands. But despite being granted permission to fight, Esther and Mordecai knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The threat of destruction still loomed over them, and the number of enemies was vast. It would take more than individual courage. It was necessary for all the Jews in the empire to unite for a common cause. Every man, woman, and child needed to understand that their survival depended on unity and collective action. Mordecai, in his position of leadership, knew he couldn't let this moment slip away. He organized an effective communication system, sending messages to all the provinces of the empire. He called upon the Jews to prepare for battle, reminding them that the fight would be tough, but victory was possible if there was cohesion. At the same time, Esther, who still had the king's confidence, began using her influence to ensure that the palace's support would be given to the Jewish people. She knew that the presence of the court was crucial for the people to feel safe and motivated. It was as though the king, despite being distant, was genuinely supporting the fight for the survival of the Jewish people, and this could be the key to giving the Jewish army the morale needed to triumph. The Jews, for their part, gathered and began organizing in different regions. Many families were in imminent danger, but with renewed hope that they could fight to preserve their lives, they began to train and prepare for what would be a difficult war. In some cities, groups of Jews banded together to strengthen their defenses and plan combat strategies. The fight for survival was not only a physical battle, but a battle for dignity and justice. However, it wasn't just the Jewish army that was preparing for battle. Haman, although now dead, had left behind a legacy of hatred and persecution, and his allies were determined to continue with their cruel plans. They still had the power to organize, and they were many. Therefore, the Jews knew the fight wouldn't be easy. The number of enemies was overwhelming, but their determination was stronger than ever. With the king's orders allowing for defense, a wave of hope spread across the people, like a beacon lighting up the darkness. But Esther and Mordecai knew that, for this victory to be guaranteed, the Jewish people needed more than just weapons and strategies. They needed faith, the faith that, despite all the adversities, God was still with them and that He would provide the means for the impossible to become possible. They had fasted, prayed, and spiritually prepared for this battle, knowing that without divine help, victory would be unattainable. This was something the Jews had always known. True strength comes from faith in God. Esther then turned again to the Lord, praying and fasting for 3 days with her servants, asking God to bless the victory of her people. She prayed for wisdom, courage, and strength for all the Jews, but also surrendered control of the situation into God's hands, trusting that if He willed, a miracle could happen. At this moment, Esther remembered her words from the first fast she had undertaken. Back then, she had risked her life by presenting herself before the king without being summoned. Now, she was at risk again, but her heart was steadfast. The battle was drawing near, but the faith and unity of the Jewish people could change their destiny. She was not alone. God was with her, with Mordecai, and with all the people of Israel. Meanwhile, in the streets, the Jews felt a renewal of energy and strength. They were ready to fight, not just for their survival, but for their identity, for their right to live in peace. Many who had previously been disheartened now felt powerful, as if a supernatural force was guiding them. The faith, courage, and leadership of Esther and Mordecai were shaping the hearts of all. And the battle would not only be fought in the physical realm. The struggle for the salvation of the Jewish people was also a spiritual battle. Esther and Mordecai understood that this fight had a much larger meaning, as it was being fought in the field of divine justice. What seemed like an impossible battle for the Jews was in fact being guided by invisible hands, preparing the way for victory. Esther prepared for the following day, the big day when the fight would begin. With the support of Mordecai and the Jewish army, she knew the chance of survival was real, but she also knew it would be a difficult battle. However, there was no turning back. The decision was made, and the Jewish people were ready to fight for their lives. This chapter teaches us that when we unite for a greater purpose, even in the face of the greatest adversities, we are capable of achieving the impossible. Unity, faith, and intelligent action are unbeatable forces, and Esther knew how to use all of these to prepare her people for the great battle that was to come. With the Jews now ready for the fight, the moment of truth was fast approaching. How would they face their enemies on the battlefield? What would be the impact of unity and faith in the face of such a great adversity? In the next video, we will see how the Jews faced the great battle for their survival, and how the strength of faith and unity was decisive for their victory. The day of the battle had finally arrived. What had seemed like a hopeless struggle was now transforming into an opportunity to show the world the power of faith, courage, and divine justice. The morning was cold, but the spirit of the Jewish people was warmed by the determination to fight, not only for their lives, but for the right to live in peace. Esther and Mordecai were in their positions, observing the preparations for the decisive confrontation. Across the empire, the Jews had organized into groups and were ready to face their enemies. It was an unequal war, but there was something that made this moment unique, the inner strength that had emerged. Each Jew, standing side by side with others, was fighting for something greater than their own life. It was a fight for their identity, their faith, and their right to continue living according to their beliefs. Meanwhile, on the other side, Israel's enemies were confident. They believed that victory was within their reach. Haman's troops, with their deep-rooted hatred, were ready to massacre the Jews. But what they did not know was that behind the lines of soldiers, there was something no one could see: the hand of God. Esther and Mordecai had fully trusted in the Lord, and that trust was about to change the course of the battle. At that moment, Esther, who had prepared with prayer and fasting, made her final request to the king. With courage, she asked that the Jews not only be allowed to defend themselves, but also be granted the right to attack their enemies. King Xerxes, with his blessing, gave the Jews full freedom to fight for their survival, and this was a pivotal turning point. With this permission, the Jewish people were now legally authorized to defend themselves and attack their oppressors, something that had previously seemed impossible. The battlefield was set, but contrary to what many might imagine, what followed was not a simple sword fight. For many, the true battle was being fought within their hearts. They were battling against fear, doubt, and hopelessness. Each Jew, as they raised their sword, felt they were being guided by something greater, something that could not be seen but could certainly be felt. Faith, which had once seemed like a mere consolation, was now the strength that kept them steadfast. The battle began with the Jews' strength surprising their enemies. They fought fiercely, as if each strike was backed by an invisible force. Many enemies fell without understanding how they were being defeated. It was as if an invisible shield was protecting and guiding them. The enemy troops, accustomed to easy victories, began to feel the weight of defeat. What should have been a simple execution of a plan was now transforming into a true collapse for the oppressors. But what made this battle even more special was the unity of the Jews. They were not only fighting for themselves, but for a future, for their families, and for the preservation of their faith. Each one was defending not only their life, but the life of others. The strength of unity was what made the difference. The Jewish army was in sync, working like a finely tuned machine with a single objective in mind: to win and ensure the survival of all. The battle dragged on, but victory was increasingly within reach. The number of enemies was falling, and the Jews' confidence grew. However, the great confrontation would not be resolved only on the battlefield. There was one last crucial element. For the victory to be complete, the power of God, who had been with them every step of the way. Esther, in her wisdom, knew that victory would not be solely the result of military strength, but also of divine intervention. And so, what seemed like a common confrontation took a supernatural turn. During the battle, Esther and Mordecai felt a sign from God. The Jewish army, with renewed faith, began to achieve decisive victories. The enemies, who thought themselves invincible, started to scatter, and soon the defeat was complete. The victory of the Jews was a clear answer to their unwavering faith. Those who had been on the brink of destruction were now celebrating victory, not only because of their own strength, but because they knew that with God on their side, nothing was impossible. The Jews succeeded in defeating their enemies, not by their human strength, but by divine intervention and the courage of Esther and Mordecai, who, with wisdom and faith, managed to turn the tide. The story of that day would become a lesson of perseverance and faith for future generations. The Jewish people had shown that when united and with God by their side, they could achieve the impossible. With the victory, a new chapter began. The Jewish people not only survived, but were strengthened in their faith and unity. The battle that could have been their destruction became a victory of hope, freedom, and faith. Esther, who had risked her life for her people, was now remembered as the heroine who brought salvation and light to her nation. Her courage became an eternal example for all those who face impossible situations. With faith and unity, even the unimaginable can be achieved. Now that the great battle has been won and the Jewish people experienced divine intervention in their lives, what happened after the victory? How did the story of Esther and Mordecai continue to impact the fate of all the Jews? Next, we will explore how the victory brought a new beginning for the Jewish people and how it shaped their future forever. After the great victory, what followed was a time of immense celebration, reflection, and renewal for the Jewish people. They not only survived an impending fate of destruction, but through Esther's courage and wisdom, they managed to turn the situation into a spiritual triumph that would echo through generations. The victory was not just a momentary relief. It was the turning point that brought hope, renewal, and a new beginning for everyone. Esther and Mordecai became icons of faith and perseverance. King Xerxes, impressed by Esther's wisdom and courage, not only confirmed the safety of the Jews, but also praised them for their bravery. He symbolically recognized that his own reign had witnessed a miracle. As a recognition of everything that had occurred, he decreed that the Jews celebrate an annual feast known as the Feast of Purim, which is still celebrated in many parts of the world today. This festival became a symbol of resistance, faith, and the certainty that even when everything seems lost, there is always an opportunity to reverse one's fate with courage and unity. The Jews, now more united than ever, celebrated Purim as a reminder of their divine salvation, and the story of Esther was passed down from generation to generation, serving as a testimony that with God by our side, the fight against the unimaginable can be won. Her story not only inspired the Jewish people, but also served as a lesson for all those facing adversity and challenges in their lives. Esther's true victory was not just over her enemies, but over the fear, doubt, and insecurity that most people face in their own journey. Today, the story of Esther and her courage continues to inspire. She was not just a woman who used her position to save her people. She was a woman of faith who was unafraid to follow God's instructions, even when it meant putting everything at risk. She knew that the victory was not in her own strength, but in the unwavering faith she held. In a world filled with uncertainties, Esther teaches us that our faith can change the course of our lives and the world around us. Her story challenges us to never give up, even in the darkest hours. As we reflect on the lessons we can learn from Esther, we see that her courage, wisdom, and faith in God are the keys to facing any situation, no matter how impossible it may seem. She is an example that by making a difference for others, we can also transform our own lives in ways we never imagined. And no matter how many adversities come our way, there is always a way out, a path of hope, when we place our trust in something greater than ourselves. But what about you? What challenges are you facing in your life today? Just like Esther, you can find the courage to face them. Remember that faith has the power to turn even the most difficult situations into opportunities for victory. Now I want to hear from you. Which lesson from Esther impacted you the most? How can you apply her courage in your life? Comment below, and don't forget to like this video if it touched your heart. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now so you won't miss any more powerful stories that can change your life. Share it with your friends so that this message reaches even further. Until the next video, where we will bring more teachings and insights that will impact your journey. Stay with us, for the transformation is just beginning. The story of Esther is a powerful reminder that no matter how many difficulties appear in our lives, we have the power to overcome them through faith, courage, and unity. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more content like this, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you don't miss any videos, like and share with your friends so more people can learn from the biblical examples we bring here. Together, we can spread more light and inspiration.